Just a nurse. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 12 minutes before the Navy SEAL commander's heart would stop beating inside Seattle General's trauma bay. The words hung in the cafeteria air like a threat disguised as observation, spoken loud enough for 3 other residents to hear, quiet enough that Katie Morrison could pretend she hadn't. She was clearing her untouched tray when his hand came down on it, deliberate, unhurried, casual as swatting a fly. The tray clattered to the floor. Applesauce splattered across white tile in geometric patterns. A plastic fork skittered across the linoleum like a needle on a record player stopping mid-song. Dr. Whitfield smiled. He was the kind of man who smiled when he hurt people, the kind whose confidence came from watching others flinch. 15 years at Seattle General had taught him that institutional power was the most durable kind. Board connections. Donor relationships. Young residents terrified of bad recommendations. Katie watched the mess spread without moving. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless, tone-deaf frequency above her head. That wasn't the worst part. 2 minutes later, Dr. Whitfield caught her in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 3, patient chart in hand, that same smile pulling at the corner of his mouth like a drawstring tightening. He was tall, the kind of tall that made doorways feel smaller, and he moved through the hospital the way apex predators move through tall grass, with the knowledge that nothing here could challenge him. His scrubs were newer than everyone else's, his shoes hadn't seen the inside of a surgery yet, but his eyes had the glaze of a man who'd learned to perform competence so well he'd mistaken it for competence. He dropped the chart at her feet. The paper folder hit tile with a hollow thud. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. Not a request. A performance. The red-headed intern from radiology was watching. The med student by the water fountain was watching. Everyone was watching because Whitfield had choreographed this moment with the precision of a conductor who knew exactly which musicians would betray each other if given the chance. Katie stood motionless for exactly 1 second. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly, the kind of muscular adjustment that wouldn't show in a photograph, that wouldn't register on a casual observer, that only someone trained to read violence would recognize as restraint. She retrieved the chart without a word. Her hands remained steady. Her face became a perfect mask of composure, the kind of blankness that came from years of practice, from learning early that showing anger meant giving your enemy ammunition. She straightened, holding the chart against her chest. Whitfield's smile widened. He'd expected tears or trembling or some small, satisfying crack in her facade. Instead, she met his eyes for 1 moment, a glance so flat and unreactive it was almost contemptuous, and returned to work. The silence that followed was the kind that made people uncomfortable, the kind where you can hear the ice machine dispensing cubes in the waiting room 3 hallways away. What he didn't know was that Katie Morrison was anything but just a nurse. She made it to the supply closet on the 3rd floor before her hand shook. The door was heavy and self-closing, the kind that muffled sound, perfect for the kind of moment that needed privacy. The shelves around her held gauze and syringes, for stands and pressure dressings, all the tools of a profession that asked her to care for strangers and never asked where she'd learned what she knew. Her scrub pocket held a single object, a tarnished military challenge coin, worn smooth by 8 years of grip, the edges rounded from being turned over in trembling hands during moments exactly like this. She pulled it out. The metallic weight of it was familiar. The coin depicted the emblem of SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, a designation that technically didn't exist anymore, that theoretically had been dissolved and absorbed into other units, except that the coin in her hand proved otherwise. She gripped it until her knuckles turned white, until the edges bit into her skin, until the physical pain became something manageable because pain was information and information could be weaponized. 8 months. That's how long Katie Morrison had been embedded at Seattle General, assigned under naval intelligence cover to quietly monitor the arrival of one specific patient, a SEAL commander who'd been read into a classified briefing about a security breach in the Pacific Theater. The operation had a code name she wasn't supposed to remember. The timeline had markers she wasn't supposed to discuss. The fact that she was gripping a challenge coin in a supply closet while her official identity as a registered nurse was being dismantled by a surgeon with a personality disorder was exactly the kind of complication that operations directorate didn't include in briefing papers. She closed her eyes. The fluorescent lights here didn't hum, the hospital had better maintain circuits on this floor, and that small absence of noise made the moment feel suspended, removed from the rest of the building's chaos. When she opened her eyes again, the trembling had stopped. Her breathing had normalized. The challenge coin went back into her pocket. She counted to 5, straightened her scrubs, and returned to the trauma bay like a woman who'd simply needed a moment to collect herself, nothing more. The intercom crackled at 14:36 hours. Katie heard it from across the ER, from where she was restocking the medication cart with the kind of methodical precision that made most people assume she was bored. The dispatch voice was calm but urgent, the practiced tone of someone who'd made 1,000 announcements but knew that each one could destroy someone's day. Incoming trauma. ETA 5 minutes. Navy training exercise accident, massive hemorrhage, cardiac involvement. SEAL Command requesting immediate Level 1 trauma alert. All hands. The words hung in the air like a change in pressure, like the moment before a thunderstorm when animals sense the barometer dropping and something ancient in their nervous systems tells them to run. Katie's hands stopped moving. Around her, the ER accelerated into controlled chaos, nurses calling out, residents appearing from back rooms, the trauma bay doors being pushed open and the crash cart being rolled into position with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this hundreds of times. She didn't move immediately. She stayed at the medication cart for 3 more seconds, counting silently, because moving too fast would signal interest and interest would signal knowledge and knowledge would signal something worth asking questions about. When she finally moved toward the trauma bay, her pace was identical to everyone else's, professional, unhurried, unremarkable. Dr. Whitfield was already there, barking orders like a conductor with delusions of grandeur. She could see him from across the room, could see the way his posture had shifted now that there was an actual emergency, could see the moment his confidence calcified into something harder and colder. He was good in trauma, that was the problem. He was genuinely, competently good at the actual medicine of saving lives, which made his personality disorder all the more dangerous because it came with the institutional power of genuine skill. Katie positioned herself at the far end of the trauma bay, near the ventilator, near the medication drawers, near the position where she could work without drawing attention. Through the bay doors, she could hear the ambulance siren getting closer. The sound of it filled the hospital like a warning, growing louder with each second, until the paramedics pushed through the sliding doors and the world became motion and urgency and the thin, fragile border between a man's life and the absolute certainty of his death. The SEAL commander was unconscious when they wheeled him in, his skin the color of old bone, his chest rising and falling in the shallow rhythm of someone whose body was already shutting down systems it deemed expendable. There was too much blood. The paramedics had applied 3 different pressure dressings and the 4th one was already saturating through, the bandage blooming red like watercolor in reverse. A paramedic was calling out vitals in that shorthand that only medical people understood, BP 68/42 and dropping. Heart rate 142, tachycardic, irregular rhythm. O2 sat 89 and falling. 2 liters in, lines are running wide open, losing ground faster than we're replacing it. Dr. Whitfield moved toward the bed like a man accepting a prize. This was his territory. This was where his competence became undeniable and his ego became justified and people would follow his orders because in a trauma bay, skill is the only currency that matters. Katie watched him from her position by the equipment, watched the way his hands moved as he began the initial assessment, watched the moment when he understood the severity of what he was looking at. His face didn't change, but something in his shoulders tensed just slightly, a micro-adjustment that suggested the magnitude of the bleeding was worse than even his considerable experience had prepared him for. The next words out of his mouth would set the tone for everything that followed. Get me 2 more large-bore 4s. Type O negative. 10 units ready for transfusion. And someone call up to blood bank, tell them we're going to need more than that. This one's a bleeder. The trauma bay transformed into a space of terrible urgency. Nurses moved between equipment stations. A resident was already intubating, preparing to secure the airway before the patient's damaged lungs couldn't hold oxygen anymore. An attending from cardiology appeared in the doorway, took one look at the cardiac monitor's irregular rhythm, and his expression shifted into something that looked like concern. The fluorescent lights above the trauma bed burned with an intensity that seemed personal, seemed designed to illuminate exactly how much blood a human body could lose before the mathematics of volume and perfusion became unsalvageable. Katie prepared the medication drawers without being asked. Epinephrine. Atropine. Sodium bicarbonate. The drugs that lived in the space between alive and dead, the chemical bridges that might hold for 15 minutes or might hold for 3. Her hands moved with the automatic precision that came from training that went deeper than any official nursing certification, training that had been conducted in field hospitals and forward operating bases where the difference between knowing what to do and hesitating meant the difference between a patient who lived and a patient who became part of a casualty count. As the commander was being transferred from the stretcher to the trauma bed, one of his hands fell away from his body and Katie caught the briefest glimpse of his forearm, scar tissue. Not surgery scars. Combat scarring. Shrapnel wounds that had been treated in theater and never fully repaired, the kind of wounds that told a story of missions and injuries and a life spent doing work that the public would never see. That's when she knew. That's when the operation that had seemed theoretical, monitor the commander's arrival, note which facility received him, record any unusual medical decisions, became absolutely, devastatingly real. The man bleeding out on that trauma bed in front of Dr. Whitfield and 7 attending physicians from Seattle General was someone Katie had last seen in Fallujah, someone she'd watched dragged into the line of fire, someone whose life she'd already tried to save once 8 years ago in the rubble of a building that had collapsed 3 seconds too late. What happened next would determine whether that moment in Fallujah stayed history or became the beginning of something that no classified operation, no cover identity, no tarnished coin in a scrub pocket could ever contain. The attending physicians gathered at the nurse's station like vultures settling on a carcass. Dr. Whitfield stood at the center, his voice pitched to carry across the entire ER, casual, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'll bet anyone here $50 the new nurse won't last a week once she realizes we do real medicine here, not whatever community college taught her to smile and take temperatures. Laughter rippled through the group. Dr. Chen smirked. Dr. Rodriguez shook his head with practiced superiority. Dr. Patel checked his watch as if Katie's presence was already a waste of his time. Katie stood 3 feet away, organizing patient charts at the secondary station. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, folder to folder, each one aligned perfectly with the last. Her jaw might have tightened, but imperceptibly. The kind of tightening that only showed if you were trained to see it. A slight tension at the hinge, nothing more. She continued working as if Whitfield had said nothing at all. As if the room full of doctors wasn't watching her reaction like hawks watching a field mouse. Her posture remained upright. Her breathing stayed controlled. There was a rhythm to her movements, left hand steady, right hand steady, the kind of physical composure that came from years of training in environments where showing weakness meant something worse than humiliation. The 7 attending physicians assigned to the commander's case, Whitfield, Chen, Rodriguez, Patel, Kim, Anderson, and Brennan, convened at 7:27 a.m. in the ICU conference room. The chart lay open on the table like an indictment. Massive internal hemorrhage from blunt force trauma. Cardiac ejection fraction at 28% and dropping. Lacerated spleen. Shattered ribs. The kind of injuries that looked like someone had driven a truck through a human body and expected him to walk away. All 7 doctors circled the same conclusion in their notes, unsalvageable. We make him comfortable, Whitfield announced, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. No heroics. No pointless procedures. The family will appreciate our candor. The other 6 nodded. Agreement was easier than courage. Whitfield had spent 18 years building a network of board connections, donor relationships, and carefully placed favors, the kind of institutional power that made questioning him feel like career suicide. Kim had 3 kids and a mortgage on a house that cost $847,000. Anderson was up for promotion. Rodriguez had already started looking at the exits, mentally calculating how many more years until he could retire. Dissent died in that room before anyone spoke it aloud. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they were probably right. The commander's case file showed no margin for error, no hidden path to survival. Whitfield had reviewed similar cases for 22 years. His success rate was exceptional. He knew when to fight and when to let go. The difference between heroism and cruelty often came down to knowing the difference between those two things. And yet his certainty had the texture of something else entirely. Not medical judgment. Not wisdom. Something closer to indifference painted over with professionalism. He'd already written the narrative. The new nurse would see the commander's condition, understand that everyone had abandoned hope, and accept the inevitable. She would learn her place. She would learn that Seattle General wasn't community college. It was real medicine, performed by real doctors, and she was just the person who held the clipboard and emptied the bedpans. Katie worked the commander's section of the ICU during her 12-hour rotation that afternoon. She moved between the rooms with the kind of quiet efficiency that most nurses spent years developing, checking monitors, adjusting for flow rates, documenting vitals in the electronic system. Her hands had performed these tasks 17,000 times, give or take. Muscle memory could do most of the work. Her mind stayed on something else. On the encrypted phone in her locker. On the message that had arrived at 3:22 a.m., maintain cover. Patient is surveillance target only. Do not deviate from established protocol. On the man lying in room for 12 who had a tattoo on his left shoulder that she'd seen before, 8 years ago, in a building that had collapsed 3 seconds too late. A visiting combat medic from a different SEAL unit, not the commander's platoon, but close enough to recognize the anatomy of trauma when he saw it, sat vigil beside the bed around 2:15 p.m. His name was Graves, call sign a breaker, and he'd spent 14 years in the teams, which meant he'd seen the inside of enough operating rooms and field hospitals to know how bodies failed and how they sometimes, inexplicably, didn't. He watched Katie work. Not in a threatening way. In the way a craftsman watches another craftsman and tries to understand their technique. The commander's sutures began failing at 2:43 p.m. Not catastrophically. A hairline separation at the incision site, old bleeding starting again, fresh blood seeping through the gauze. Katie was there in 4 seconds. She didn't call for a doctor. She didn't wait for permission. She simply moved, gathering supplies, examining the site, her hands already knowing what needed to happen. She had a 14-gauge angiocath needle ready, the kind used for rapid vein access, and she was already prepping the resuturing site with the kind of methodical precision that had nothing to do with her job description as a nurse. This was trauma surgery. This was field medicine. This was something else entirely. Graves stood abruptly. His eyes locked onto her hands, specifically onto the pattern she was using, the angle of the needle, the depth of the sutures, the way she was working from the center outward rather than following the conventional linear pattern. He'd seen that exact technique once before, during a deployment to Fallujah in 2016, when a combat medic had been forced to close a gut wound in the rubble of a collapsed building with whatever supplies were available and enough skill to make it hold long enough for transport. The suture pattern was distinctive. Unmistakable. "That's a Fallujah field cut," Graves said quietly. The words came out as a statement, not a question. "Where the hell did you learn to do that?" The room seemed to contract. Katie met his eyes for exactly 1 second. 1 full second of absolute silence where her face revealed nothing, not surprise, not fear, not recognition, not denial. The kind of blank professional composure that trained operatives wore when they were deciding what to do. Then she returned to her work. Her hands continued moving, suture by suture, her attention entirely on the incision site. "I trained under trauma surgeons," she said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that only Graves could hear. "Before I became a nurse." It wasn't entirely untrue. It was the kind of statement that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on what you already believed about her. Her hand stayed steady. The sutures went in clean and precise. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. The rhythm of the heart monitor remained constant, steady, mechanical, alive. Graves backed away slowly, his confusion visible in the set of his shoulders. He didn't push. Whatever he'd glimpsed in that moment, whatever his combat intuition was telling him about the woman in scrubs closing a wound with the precision of someone who'd done this in conditions far worse than a sterile OR, he seemed to understand that asking questions would be the wrong move. He returned to his chair beside the commander's bed and watched the rest of the procedure in silence. His encrypted phone was in his pocket, and he would send a message to his unit commander at 6:13 p.m., encountered unfamiliar personnel at Seattle General. Possible classified connection. Running silent pending authorization. But he would wait for clearance before he did anything else. That was how the teams worked. You moved only when the order came down. You observed. You reported. You didn't make assumptions. Katie finished the suturing at 3:12 p.m. The incision was clean. The bleeding was controlled. The commander's vitals remained stable, BP 118/74, heart rate 78, O2 sat at 96%. All numbers that suggested someone with a functioning cardiovascular system. Someone who wasn't dead yet. Someone who might, if circumstances aligned and decisions were made differently than 7 attending physicians had already decided, still have a chance at survival. She documented the procedure in the medical record and returned to her other patients. None of the 7 doctors came to examine her work. They didn't need to. Their decision had been made. Whatever she did, whatever complications she managed or prevented, wouldn't change the agreed-upon narrative. The commander was unsalvageable. She was just the new nurse. And in 7 days, or 14, or whenever she finally understood what real medicine looked like, she would be gone. That night, Katie sat alone in her car in the Seattle General parking garage on the 4th level. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above her. The challenge coin rested on her palm, tarnished silver with an eagle embossed on one side and an inscription on the other. Commander J. Reyes, SEAL Team 3, Fallujah 2016. She turned it over slowly. Her encrypted phone buzzed at 11:06 p.m. The message was from her handler in Naval Intelligence, status report overdue. Confirm patient identity. Maintain cover protocol. Do not engage. She stared at the screen for 47 seconds. Then she typed, confirmed. Cover maintained. Standing by for authorization. The response came in 9 seconds, negative. Observe only. Operation continues. Stand down. She closed her eyes and gripped the steering wheel. In room for 12, 4 floors above her head, a man whose life she'd already tried to save once in the rubble of a collapsing building was sleeping under the care of doctors who decided to let him die. Her orders were clear. Her mission was clear. Her job was to gather intelligence, observe, and report, nothing more. She was a ghost in a nurse's uniform, and ghosts didn't save lives. They watched. They recorded. They moved on. But ghosts didn't carry challenge coins that weighed like anchors in their pockets either. The routine exam was supposed to be simple. Just vitals, chart review, standard post-crisis monitoring. Katie Morrison moved through the ICU with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times before, blood pressure cuff, stethoscope, temperature check, notation in the chart. The commander slept fitfully, his chest rising and falling beneath the hospital gown, bandages white against bronze skin still marked by the geography of old scars. She knew those scars. She had watched him get them. It was 2:34 a.m. when she noticed the oxygen saturation beginning to drift. 97%. Then 95%. Not alarming yet, but wrong. A subtle shift in the rhythm of his breathing. She adjusted the nasal cannula, checked the tubing for kinks, confirmed the flow rate was correct at 4 liters per minute. The sat drifted lower. 93, 91. Katie's eyes narrowed. She had seen this progression before, the body's quiet way of signaling that something deeper was failing. She reached for his wrist, feeling for the radial pulse. Present, but rapid. Too rapid. The challenge coin in her scrub pocket suddenly felt heavier. At 2:41 a.m., alarm screamed through the ICU like a fire siren in a bunker. The monitor showed a rhythm that was not a rhythm at all: chaos, electrical frenzy, the heart beating itself into futility. Ventricular fibrillation. Flatline was next if something didn't stop it. Katie was already moving, her body responding before her brain finished the thought. She pressed the code button. The mechanical announcement echoed through the corridors: Code Blue, ICU. Code Blue, ICU. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had already survived the worst, gloved, steady, reaching for the crash cart that materialized like it had been waiting exactly where she needed it. Compressions. 60 to 100 per minute, the rhythm burned into muscle memory from 1,000 training drills and 200 real ones. The sternum compressed under her hands, 2 inches deep, release, compress again. 1 and 2 and 3. The chest was a drum and she was the only musician who remembered the song. Epinephrine was drawn up, 1 milligram for push, medication that would shock the heart into remembering how to work. Defibrillator pads went on bare skin. Clear, someone said. The body arched. Nothing. The monitor still sang its terrible flatline song. Dr. Whitfield arrived first, moving with the command presence of someone used to room stopping when he entered. For other physicians followed in his wake like satellites around a star gone dark. Their names were Dr. Chen, Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Patel, and Dr. Kumar, all competent, all trained, all certain of what they were seeing. Katie's arms continued their rhythmic work while they moved into position around the bed, checking monitors, verifying arrest, running through the protocols that had been established long before this moment. 6 minutes. They pushed drugs. Another round of defibrillation. The monitor remained unmoved. Dr. Chen's face hardened into the expression of someone making a calculation. "We're not getting any response," he said, his voice the texture of a gate closing. 6 minutes of compressions, 0 perfusion improvement. 3 more minutes. The commander's pupils were fixed and dilated. Dr. Rodriguez checked them, adjusted the light, checked again. "Probably cerebral edema by now," he said quietly. "Even if we get ROSC, we're looking at significant brain damage." ROSC. Return of spontaneous circulation. A phrase that meant nothing right now because nothing was happening. Katie's arms burned. Sweat ran down her temples. The hospital gown beneath the commander's chest was soaked with the moisture of effort and desperation. His skin was cooling. She could feel it, the warmth leaving him like a light switching off. Around her, the other doctors exchanged glances. The kind of glances that come before someone says the words no one wants to say. Dr. Patel spoke first. "I'm calling this." He stepped back from the bed, his hands dropping to his sides. 9 minutes. No signs of life. No response to interventions. Per hospital futile resuscitation protocol section 4.2, I recommend cessation of resuscitative efforts. He turned to Dr. Whitfield. An acknowledgement. A permission asking. Dr. Rodriguez followed. Then Dr. Kumar. All of them backing away from the bed, from the body, from the idea that anything here could be saved. They left in sequence like pallbearers leaving a grave, moving toward the ICU doors, their work done, their protocols satisfied, their liability managed. 7 doctors had written this man off days ago. Now their decision was becoming true. Dr. Whitfield was last. He stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame, watching Katie's hands continue their relentless work. The compressions had not stopped. The chest was still rising and falling to the rhythm of her effort. His expression shifted into something that looked like triumph mixed with satisfaction, a man whose certainty about how the world worked was being confirmed in real time. "Call it, Nurse Morrison." "That's an order." His voice was the sound of a door locking. "Hospital policy is clear. Cease resuscitation immediately." Katie's hands did not slow. Did not pause. Did not acknowledge that she had heard him at all. Her eyes remained fixed on the chest beneath her palms, on the monitors that showed nothing, on the challenge coin that suddenly felt warm in her pocket as though it had a heartbeat of its own. "Doctor, I believe," she started, but her voice was quiet, deferential still, the mask intact despite everything burning beneath it. "I said call it." Dr. Whitfield's voice hardened. "Cease compressions. Document time of death." "That's not a suggestion." He left. The ICU door swung shut behind him with a whisper like a goodbye. The monitoring equipment showed flat line. Just a flat green line moving across the screen in its endless, empty rhythm. The alarms were silenced now, no point in screaming at a dead man. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead. The ventilator continued its slow mechanical breathing, pumping air into lungs that had stopped using it. Protocol said stop. The hospital policy said stop. Dr. Whitfield's direct order said stop. Her encrypted handler, the one she had never met in person, had told her to observe only and maintain cover. All of it said stop. Katie reached for the surgical kit. Her hands moved with absolute precision, not hesitating, not second-guessing, not asking permission from an institution that had already given up. The scalpel was sharp enough to cut through skin without resistance. She made the cut left anterolateral, along the fifth intercostal space, right where the textbook said and where her hands had done this before in a building in Fallujah that was falling down while people screamed. The chest opened like a book someone finally wanted to read. Muscle and fascia and the pale gleam of ribs beneath. She could see his heart now, still and grey, a muscle that had forgotten its purpose. She reached in with her bare hand and found it, felt its weight, felt the cold of it. Muscle memory took over. Her fingers began to move, to compress, to squeeze the heart the way no machine could, the way only human hands could, with the knowledge that came from having held another human being together while everything was falling apart. 15 minutes. Her arm screamed. Her shoulder burned as though it was on fire. Sweat dripped into the open cavity of his chest, mixing with blood that had begun to seem less like blood and more like evidence of a body she was trying to convince to stay alive. The heart beneath her palm was unresponsive, dead weight, a muscle that had given up. But her hands did not stop. Could not stop. The challenge coin had fallen out of her pocket somewhere in the first 5 minutes. She had felt it drop, felt the weight leave her, and something about that had made her grip tighter, work harder, as though she was squeezing the coin's weight back into existence through sheer force of will. 16 minutes. The cardiac monitor still showed nothing. Her vision blurred. She blinked once, hard, and kept working. This was not a patient. This was not a stranger. This was someone who had dragged her out of rubble in Fallujah while his own leg was shattered, who had made her promise she would live differently than he was living, whose hand had pressed the commander's coin into her palm in that moment before the helicopters came. This was someone she owed a debt she could never repay except by refusing to stop. At minute 17, something changed. It was subtle, a flutter beneath her palm that might have been nothing, might have been the electrical artifact of her own compressions, might have been the body's last reflexive twitch before it surrendered completely. But her hands felt it. Her hands knew the difference between death and the possibility of something else. She compressed harder. One more time. The heart muscle responded. A flutter became a contraction. A contraction became a rhythm. The monitor shifted, still chaotic, still wrong, but not flat. Ventricular fibrillation. Terrible. Survivable. The chest beneath her hand suddenly felt warm again, felt alive again, felt like a body that had been granted a reprieve it did not deserve. The doors to the ICU burst open. 2 nurses stood frozen in the frame, eyes wide, mouths open, watching a woman kneeling inside a man's open chest cavity as though witnessing something that violated the laws of physics and medicine simultaneously. But Katie's hands did not stop. Would not stop. The heart continued its beating beneath her palm, wild, erratic, but present. Sinus rhythm had not arrived yet, but the moment was no longer lost. The moment was no longer gone. "Get me a pacing wire and the crash cart for medications," she said, and her voice was no longer the deferential voice of a nurse. It was the voice of someone who had watched 7 doctors walk away from something she refused to accept. And someone call for a surgeon. We're going to need a thoracotomy tray and intensive monitoring. Move. The nurses moved. The monitor's rhythm had been flatlined for 17 minutes. Asystole. No electrical activity. No hope. 7 doctors had declared it. 7 attending physicians had walked away one by one, their white coats trailing behind them like ghosts exiting a tomb. The last one had actually looked relieved, relieved to leave, relieved to stop trying, relieved that the decision had been made for him. Katie's hands didn't tremble. Her jaw didn't clench. Her eyes didn't fill with tears. She simply looked down at the commander's exposed chest cavity, at the sterile field already being broken, at the code status being changed to comfort care on the whiteboard. And then something shifted. Not in her hands. In her breathing. A single long exhale that sounded like a pressure valve releasing. "Step back," she said to the resident who had been assisting. Her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Not a request. Not a suggestion. A command delivered in the tone of someone who had already made peace with the consequences of disobedience. The resident stepped back immediately. Katie's hands moved. They always moved when the time came. She didn't think about it anymore. Thinking was the problem. Thinking made you hesitate. Hesitation killed people. Her fingers positioned themselves with the precision of a pianist who had played the same composition 10,000 times. Muscle memory transformed into something that looked like instinct but was actually the calcified residue of training so brutal that it had become bone deep. She cracked the sternum. The sound was specific, not the cartoon crack of movies but a controlled fracture, a bone saw's steady cut. The stainless steel retractor slid into place. She had the internal paddles ready before anyone could process what was happening. Direct cardiac massage. Open the chest. Get your hands on the heart. Feel the muscle. Coax it back to rhythm through sheer skill and the kind of persistence that came from having already watched people die. Epinephrine 4 push. 1 milligram. The medication raced through the arterial line. Katie's gloved hands, her actual hands, not a mechanical device, not a machine, wrapped around the commander's ventricles. She began the compressions. Not the standard rhythm of CPR. This was different. This was a conversation between her hands and a failing heart conducted in the language of pressure and timing and something that most people would have called luck but which she recognized as the only form of prayer she still believed in. Compress. Release. Compress. Release. The rhythm like a metronome. Like the rotor wash of a Black Hawk hovering overhead. Like the sound of her own heartbeat amplified 1,000 times through the machinery of this particular trauma bay. The resident watching her noticed something odd. She wasn't moving frantically. There was no panic in her shoulders. No desperation in her grip. Instead, her face had gone completely neutral, not the blank stare of someone shutting down, but the absolute clarity of an operator running a mission protocol. The kind of focus that only existed in people who had already survived the unsurvivable. 30 seconds. No change. Monitor still flat. Katie continued. Her hands moved with a precision that looked almost meditative, almost transcendent. The muscles in her forearms worked with mechanical efficiency, each compression sent a calculated pulse through the organ beneath her fingers. Blood flow. That was all it was. Blood flow meant oxygen. Oxygen meant hope. 60 seconds. 90 seconds. At 2 minutes, someone in the doorway said, "This isn't going to work." Katie didn't even turn her head. "Another epi," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. Not louder. Quieter. The kind of quiet that made people listen. 120 seconds in. The monitor remained asystole. No electrical activity. No response. By every protocol, by every standard of care, by every metric that modern medicine used to measure failure, this was over. The commander was dead. He had been dead for over 2 minutes. Brain damage began at 4 minutes without blood flow. Katie didn't count minutes. She counted compressions. She counted heartbeats. She counted the seconds between each surge of medication. She counted the small moments when the muscle beneath her hand seemed to listen, seemed to remember what it was supposed to do. For minutes. The resident, a young surgeon fresh from his fellowship, watched her hands move and felt something crack open inside his chest. This wasn't what they had taught him in training. This was beyond training. This was archaeology. This was exhuming something that everyone else had already buried. 8 minutes in, Katie felt it. A flutter. Not a full contraction. Not sinus rhythm. But something. A single beat that suggested the heart remembered it had a job. She didn't celebrate. Celebration was a luxury. She adjusted the pace. Changed the angle. Let her hands become an extension of her will rather than her volition. 12 minutes. 14 minutes. At 15 minutes and 30 seconds, the monitor changed. A blip. Then another. Then a rhythm that wasn't quite organized but was unmistakably present. Not normal. Not yet. But alive. The heart had remembered. The muscle had listened. Sinus rhythm, Katie said. Her voice carried the same neutral tone it would have used to order coffee. She didn't remove her hands. She monitored the monitor. Watched the rhythm organize itself from chaotic squiggles into something that resembled the pattern of an actual living heart. The blood pressure began to climb. 45/20. 50/25. Still in shock but trending upward. Trending alive. The resident who had been standing in the doorway, the one who had said it wasn't going to work, was now pressing his hand against the wall. His other hand had come up to cover his mouth. Katie still didn't look at him. She was already calling for supplies, already asking for someone to assist with chest closure, already transitioning the commander's management from necromancy to standard post-arrest protocol. She had her hands out of the chest cavity in less than 30 seconds. Methodical. Practiced. The kind of speed that came from having done something so many times that the steps had merged into a single fluid motion. Suture. Close. Hand off to the resident. The ICU transport team was already standing by, already running the numbers on fluids and medications, already moving with the urgency of people who understood they were working with a miracle. It was at that exact moment, the moment when the stretcher was rolling toward the surgical ICU, when the code was transitioning from trauma to recovery, when Katie was already turning to begin clearing the equipment, that Dr. Whitfield walked back into the trauma bay. His face moved through 3 expressions in rapid succession. First confusion, because the monitor was clearly showing organized rhythm. Then understanding, because his eyes found Katie and registered that she was covered in blood. Then something darker. Something that looked like the kind of fury that only comes when your certainty has been proven catastrophically wrong. "What the hell have you done?" he said. Not asked. Said. The words carried the weight of accusation. Katie removed her gloves slowly. Each one peeled away from her hands with deliberate precision. She could feel the resident watching her. Could feel the attending from anesthesia standing frozen near the crash cart. Could feel the entire ecosystem of the trauma bay holding its breath. "He's stable, doctor," Katie said. Her voice had flattened. Not emotional. Not defiant. Just a statement of fact delivered with the kind of certainty that couldn't be argued with. Heart rhythm restored. BP responding to fluid resuscitation. O2 sat climbing. He's in the ICU. Dr. Whitfield's face had gone the color of old newspaper. His eyes were on the monitor, on the organized rhythm playing out in real time, on the commander's vitals continuing to trend upward as they prepared him for transport. For the first time since Katie had arrived at Seattle General, she watched something flicker across his expression that looked almost like fear. He pulled out his phone before he even left the trauma bay. She heard him in the hallway. His voice had gone up an octave, the tone of someone who had just realized the board was about to move against him. "Get me the chief of medicine. Now. I don't care if he's in surgery. Now." Katie finished stripping off her protective gear. She tossed the surgical cap into the biohazard bin. The resident who had watched the impossible happen was now staring at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. That was... He started, but there weren't words. There was no medical terminology that covered what he had just witnessed. There was no protocol that explained how someone brought a patient back from 17 minutes of asystole with nothing but their hands and what looked like pure refusal to accept the verdict of 7 attending physicians. The next 30 minutes moved with the speed of falling dominoes. Dr. Whitfield was on his phone for most of them. 3 board members. The hospital administrator. The credentialing office. Katie heard fragments of his voice drifting through the hallway. Suspicious credentials? Unsupervised procedure? Independent investigation. Personnel file. The tone was urgent. The tone was frightened. The tone was a man who had just watched his institutional authority face something it couldn't dismiss. Katie was in the nurse's station charting when the hospital security officer found her. He was a kind man, a grandfather type with gentle hands and 30 years of service, and his face showed genuine conflict as he approached. "Nurse Morrison, I need to escort you to administration. There's been a suspension order." She didn't argue. Argument implied you believed you had a choice. She simply nodded, logged out of the computer, and followed him toward the administrative wing. The hallway felt different now, shorter somehow, even though the distance hadn't changed. Colleagues who had ignored her for 8 months now turned to watch her pass. Word had already traveled that she had brought someone back from a 17-minute code. Word had also begun to travel that Dr. Whitfield was trying to destroy her. The administrator's office was all leather furniture and mahogany, the kind of space designed to remind you that you were in the presence of institutional power. The hospital's chief counsel was already there. So was Dr. Whitfield, his color still off, his jaw working like he was chewing something bitter. "Nurse Morrison, your credentials are under investigation," the administrator said. Not angry. Professional. The kind of detachment that suggested this was already above his pay grade and would soon be above everyone's. "An external review has been initiated. Pending the outcome, you're suspended from duty effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises. You'll be notified of the investigation timeline within 5 business days." They confiscated her badge at the entrance. 7 months and 23 days of access, revoked in the time it took to scan a card. She walked past the cafeteria where Whitfield had knocked her tray to the floor. Past the nurse's station where she had never raised her voice. Past the trauma bay where she had just brought a dead man back to life with her bare hands. The security guard didn't speak. He understood, somehow, that conversation wasn't what was needed. Outside, the Philadelphia night was cold and tasted like rain that hadn't fallen yet. She didn't go home. Home was an efficiency apartment rented under a cover identity, and that apartment was already contaminated. 8 months of naval intelligence cover operation, disintegrating in real time. Her handler had called 17 times. She could feel the notification stacking up in her pocket like a countdown timer. At 3:17 a.m., Katie sat in a diner that never closed, in a booth with red vinyl seats that had been stitched and restitched 1,000 times, watching her own reflection in the dark window glass. Her coffee had gone cold 40 minutes ago. The waitress had stopped asking if she needed anything after the 3rd check. The place was empty except for a man at the counter reading yesterday's newspaper and a teenager doing homework in the corner booth. Katie reached into her scrub pocket. The challenge coin was still there. 8 months of carrying it. 8 months of feeling its weight against her leg every shift. The tarnished surface had been polished by her fingers so many times that the original pattern was almost invisible now. Just a dull metal disc that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know its story. Meant everything to everyone who did. The commander's face had been unconscious, his body broken, his vitals slipping away while 7 doctors collectively surrendered. She had felt his heart stop under her hands. She had felt the exact moment when the muscle gave up. And then she had convinced it to try again. She pressed the coin into her palm and wondered if saving one life was worth blowing an 8-month operation. Wondered if naval intelligence would pull her from the field permanently. Wondered if the tarnished disc in her hand was payment enough for a debt that had never really been about money. Her phone buzzed. Another message from her handler. This one just said, "Stand by for extraction. New orders incoming." Katie didn't stand by for anything. She sat in that diner, watching the rain that hadn't fallen yet gather in the dark window, and made a decision that would change the next 48 hours irreversibly. The morning news broadcast flickered to life on the lobby television at 6:27 a.m., and the entire emergency department froze. Katie's photograph filled the screen, not the soft headshot from her fake nursing credentials, but a military portrait, jaw set, eyes that had seen things the ER staff couldn't comprehend, dress uniform with insignia that meant nothing to civilians but everything to those who understood the weight of metals on a chest. The headline read in bold white text, "Decorated Combat Medic Missing After Classified Deployment." The room went dead silent. Dr. Chen's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. A resident's pen fell from her fingers and clattered against the tile floor. Two nurses standing at the medication dispensary turned toward each other, eyes widening with the slow realization that the woman they'd watched push a stretcher for 8 months wasn't who they thought she was. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm above, indifferent to the seismic shift happening below them. Katie stood at the central station, hand steady as surgical steel, charting vitals for a post-op patient. She didn't look up at the television. She didn't flinch. She didn't acknowledge the 17 pairs of eyes turning toward her in unison. Her fingers continued moving across the keyboard, methodical, precise, the only sound in the paralyzed ER the soft click of keys and her own measured breathing. The segment ended. Another medical story began. But no one stopped watching her. The commander was conscious now, 3 days post-resuscitation, the kind of conscious that came with the terrifying understanding that he should be dead. His hospital bed occupied the ICU's corner room, machines tracking the rhythm of a heart that Katie's bare hands had coaxed back to life. He'd been asking for her since he woke up, not by name, because he didn't know her name had changed. By something else. By a call sign whispered between 2 a.m. morphine doses and the weight of memories that never quite stayed buried. A visiting lieutenant commander approached Katie's station at 7:23 a.m., moved with the economical grace of someone trained in tactical environments, and waited until she made eye contact. His uniform displayed the insignia of Naval Special Warfare Command. His eyes held the recognition of someone who'd walked through Fallujah's Jolan district and come out the other side transformed. He lowered his voice, not a question, a statement, a name that wasn't her name anymore. Nomad. Katie's hands didn't hesitate on the keyboard. The word landed in her chest like a detonation charge set to a specific frequency. Only 3 people had called her that in 8 years. 2 of them were dead. The third was lying in a hospital bed 70 feet away with tubes running into his chest. She met the lieutenant commander's eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Didn't nod. Didn't speak. Just the slightest tilt of her chin, acknowledgement from one warrior to another, the language that transcended cover and mission parameters and every lie she'd told in the past 8 months. The next voice came from the lobby entrance at 7:31 a.m. The veteran security guard, the one who'd worked Seattle General's doors for 19 years, who'd never missed a detail, who'd seen a lot of things but never seen anything like this, stood at rigid attention. His hand moved to his chest in a salute that belonged in a different world, a formal declaration broadcast across the ER with the precision of a rifle shot. Master Chief Petty Officer on deck. The words carried weight that made physicists weep. Master Chief Petty Officer was the highest enlisted rank in the Navy, a designation earned through blood and competence and years of making impossible choices in impossible places. Every resident in that emergency department understood what they were standing in the presence of without knowing a single detail of Katie's actual history. Dr. Whitfield's face appeared in the doorway of his office, pale as surgical gauze. The sliding doors to the ER entrance opened at 7:34 a.m., and the air pressure changed. Not metaphorically. Literally. A two-star admiral walked through those doors with a kind of presence that made the fluorescent light seem to dim by comparison, not physically, but somehow the room gathered its attention around him like iron filings around a magnet. He wore dress whites, and his chest displayed medals that gleamed like compressed sunlight. His staff uniform carried the weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives across multiple continents. He approached Katie with formal deliberation. The entire ER watched. 23 staff members. 7 attending physicians scattered throughout the department, all of them drifting back toward the central station like witnesses to an execution that would determine the future. The admiral spoke in the cadence of someone used to being heard the first time, his voice carrying across the department with the clarity of a command at parade rest. Master Chief Morrison. Combat Medic. 8 years active duty, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, attached to JSOC Task Force 121. Bronze Star for Valor under fire. June 2009, Anbar Province. Bronze Star for Valor under fire. March 2010, Helmand Province. Bronze Star for Valor under fire. August 2011, Logar Province. 2 Purple Hearts. And a Navy Cross for actions in Fallujah that remain classified. Each medal was its own sentence. Each one landed like a detonation charge in the silence that had swallowed the emergency department whole. Bronze Star. 1. Bronze Star. 2. Bronze Star. 3. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. And then, delivered with the finality of a gavel striking wood, Navy Cross. The Navy Cross was given for extraordinary heroism in combat. It was the second highest combat medal the United States military awarded to enlisted personnel. Katie Morrison, who'd pushed gurneys through these hallways, who'd been ordered to pick up a chart from the floor without a word of protest, who'd been called sweetheart and dismissed and humiliated and suspended, she'd earned a Navy Cross. Dr. Chen's hand moved to cover his mouth. The commander's voice came from the ICU at 7:41 a.m., hoarse from the ventilator tubes that had been removed only hours before, but strong enough to carry the weight of truth. His wheelchair sat angled so he could see the central station, and his eyes, still recovering their focus, still adjusting to consciousness after being gone, found Katie with the precision of a homing beacon. She was my team medic. Fallujah. Jolan District. The building came down on us, collapsing right on top, and everyone started moving the other way. Toward the exits. Toward survival. The commander's breath came in measured increments, the speech pattern of someone managing pain through disciplined breathing. Katie came in the opposite direction. Into the collapse. Grabbed me by the tactical vest and dragged me out. Shrapnel took her through the left shoulder, through her rib cage, he paused, and the medical staff understood he was calculating which details could be discussed openly. She got me out. Then she went back. She got 4 more Marines out of that building. The room remained silent for exactly 10 full seconds. The count stretched like a held breath, like the ER itself was observing a moment of something between horror and recognition. Katie Morrison had saved 7 lives in Fallujah. She'd saved the commander's life 3 days ago by ignoring the orders of 7 attending physicians and breaking his sternum open. Silence was all that could be offered in return. Federal investigators arrived at Seattle General at 9:16 a.m., moving through the hallways with the gravitational pull of authority. Special Agent Martinez carried a file folder that was getting thicker by the hour. She interviewed Dr. Chen first. Then the resident who'd watched Katie's hands move during the suturing. Then the combat medic visitor who'd recognized the Fallujah field cut technique. Then the 12 other staff members who'd witnessed Dr. Whitfield's treatment of her, the knocked cafeteria tray, the chart thrown at her feet, the public humiliation designed to break someone's spirit through the simple application of institutional cruelty. The security footage was damning in its clarity, high-definition video of a man in surgical scrubs, face flushed with the kind of rage that came from loss of control, deliberately knocking a tray to the floor. The hospital administrator watched it twice without speaking. Dr. Whitfield's network meant nothing when federal charges entered the equation. Board members stopped answering his calls by 10:38 a.m. The donors who'd backed his research grants for 17 years suddenly had conflicts of interest. Colleagues who'd feared him for 2 decades began offering statements to federal investigators with the enthusiasm of people finally authorized to speak truth aloud. The forged documents were crude work, done in panic, timestamps altered by hands that trembled, fabricated concerns typed in a font slightly different from the originals, false information planted in personnel files with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Dr. Whitfield had attempted to create evidence of Katie's negligence to justify his decision to abandon the commander's care. The forgeries were the work of a man running out of time, out of allies, out of institutional armor. By 4:13 p.m., the FBI was ready to move. The arrest happened in the Seattle General parking lot at 4:52 p.m., and the local news stations had been tipped off with just enough notice to position their cameras in the right locations. Dr. Whitfield came out of the hospital's south entrance, moving toward his vehicle, a 2019 Mercedes, the color of hospital steel, and 2 federal agents stepped into his path with the formal politeness of people trained in execution. The handcuffs were chrome and caught the late afternoon light. The perp walk lasted exactly 47 seconds from the hospital entrance to the federal vehicle. News cameras captured every moment. The man who'd run Seattle General through a web of board connections and institutional favors, the surgeon who'd publicly bet $50 that a new nurse wouldn't last a week, being placed into a federal sedan with his hand on his head, his face a study in the realization that his network couldn't protect him when the federal government decided it was time to move. His colleagues watched from the hospital windows. Not one of them looked away. Katie stood at the ER entrance as the federal vehicle pulled away, her expression precise and controlled as a surgical instrument. The Admiral stood beside her in his dress whites, and he waited until the parking lot went quiet before speaking. "You blew your cover for him," the Admiral said. Not a question. A statement of observable fact. Katie nodded once. "Yes, sir." "Was it worth it?" She watched the federal vehicle disappear down the street, already becoming traffic, already becoming history. "Yes, sir." The Admiral studied her for a moment, the kind of study that measured something deeper than surface compliance. "Welcome back, Master Chief." 2 years passed like a page turning. Someone spotted Dr. Whitfield in the parking lot of a strip mall in suburban Philadelphia, the kind of commercial space that hosted tax preparation services and cell phone repair shops and discount vitamin retailers. He stood behind a folding table, the cheap kind with gray metal legs and a faded plastic top, selling supplemental insurance policies to people who'd never heard his name, never knew he'd once commanded an entire hospital through fear and institutional leverage. His medical license was gone. His reputation was nuclear dust. The colleagues who'd feared him now existed in a world where his name wasn't spoken aloud. That same day, Katie Morrison stood in dress uniform in Washington, D.C., at a naval promotion ceremony conducted in the ornate halls of the Pentagon's E-Ring. The commander stood beside her, his own uniform carrying the scars of Fallujah woven into every ribbon and medal, a man brought back from the edge of death by someone he'd served with, someone he'd thought was lost to the machinery of classified operations. An admiral, a different admiral, higher rank, more stars, stepped forward and pinned a new decoration on Katie's chest. The medal was gold and silver and carried a weight that transcended its actual physical mass. But what gleamed brighter than the medal itself was the small object pinned directly beside it, a tarnished military challenge coin, the kind issued to SEAL teams, the kind that carried the weight of brotherhood and sacrifice. It was the coin the commander had pressed into Katie's palm in Fallujah while bleeding out, the one she'd gripped in that supply closet, the one she'd carried through 8 months of cover and humiliation and the choice to break every protocol because saving one life was worth more than any operation. The Admiral presented it formally. This coin was earned in Fallujah. It remains classified. Your service to this nation remains classified. But your value does not. The ceremony ended at 2:17 p.m. Attendees filed out in the formal disorder of military protocol. A young Navy corpsman, 19 years old, fresh from basic training, still carrying the shine of not yet knowing what she didn't know, approached Katie with a combination of reverence and nervousness that made the Master Chief's mouth almost move into something resembling a smile. "Master Chief, I heard you worked as a nurse. That you were invisible. How did you do it?" Katie looked down at the challenge coin gleaming on her chest, then at the medals that represented decisions made under fire, blood spilled to save people who would never know her real name, 8 months of controlled rage compressed into a single choice to defy 7 attending physicians and 1 arrogant surgeon. Power is not a title, Katie said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned this truth in Fallujah and verified it in Philadelphia. Power is the ability to help. The corpsman nodded, understanding something she wouldn't fully comprehend for another 5 years of service. A waiting car sat at the Pentagon's curb, engine running, the kind of vehicle that belonged to the work that required classified operations and invisible warriors. Katie walked toward it, her uniform catching the light, the challenge coin catching light, medals catching light. The commander sat in the back seat with his door open, his own uniform a mirror of sacrifice and survival. "You ready?" he asked as she settled beside him. Katie looked at the tarnished coin, then at the man who'd handed it to her while dying, who she'd brought back from clinical death, who understood without words the currency that mattered more than money or titles or institutional power. "Always," she said. The car pulled away from the Pentagon into the Washington traffic, and 2 warriors who'd saved each other twice disappeared into the machinery of classified work, bound by nothing more visible than a tarnished coin and the only truth that ever mattered. When everyone else walked away, they stayed. If this story about hidden strength and invisible heroism resonated with you, please subscribe, like this video, and comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? I'd love to hear your story.